Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa, and recently I made a dress for my niece and had some of the red lace from it left over. And it's really nice lace, so I knew I wanted to use it as the kind of, showcase part of another dress. So I decided to make a dinner dress for my mom. For the design, I decided on an off-shoulder bodice, probably in red with the lace, and then a black velvet fitted skirt. So first off, I had to figure out my pattern. I started by taking a princess seam bodice pattern and using the instructions from the book So Many Dresses, So Little Time to modify it to have off-shoulder straps. And basically the directions kind of come down to pretty much extending the shoulder seam down and then extending the side seam of the center front pattern piece up until the two lines cross, and that makes the outer edge of the shoulder seam. And then basically the inside edge of it is right where the outer edge of the original seam ended, and you just kind of curve that across into the neckline, and then repeat that for the back as well. Now, I was a little nervous about how this part would turn out because even though I was using a princess seam pattern, I was not using the one that came with the book, and so I wasn't sure if that side seam was in the right place or not. So I did go ahead and do a mock-up. And when Mom tried on the mock-up, I found that the shoulder seam just seemed kind of too wide and really very pointy. So I went ahead and trimmed down the pattern to make it a bit of a narrower shoulder seam, which fortunately meant that all I had to do to adjust the mock-up to see how that new change fit was just trim it down off of that as well. And narrowing it did seem to help, and I kind of came up with a plan for how to help with the point, but I'll talk about that later in the assembly part. For now, we're moving on to the skirt pattern. So I used the straight skirt pattern from the same book that I mentioned earlier. I just traced the pattern size that had the closest waist measurement to the waist measurement of the bodice. Now, the size that I copied was a little smaller than the bodice, so I knew there were going to be some adjustments needed. But once I had it copied and cut out, I discovered that actually the only adjustment that was needed was to just not sew the darts on the front of the skirt, which, as modifications go, was a much easier one to do because it really didn't require me to do anything to the pattern and actually took out a step when it came to actually sewing it. However, I did go ahead and make a mock-up just to make sure that eliminating those darts didn't affect the fit, and also to make sure that the length was correct. Mom approved the length, and at this point I pulled out the lace to make sure I had enough to do the bodice. And to my surprise, I not only had enough to do the bodice, but I had so much that I could decide, did I want to do the bodice or did I want to do the skirt with the lace? And since I had enough to do that, I decided to go ahead and use the lace for the skirt, because then I could keep those scallops on the lace and use them for the hem of the skirt. Since I was making that change, I decided to just use black satin for the top. For the skirt, I cut the lining out of red satin. I needed one front piece and two back pieces. And then after they were cut out, I immediately went ahead and hemmed all of the pieces. And this is because I am now going to flatline it onto the lace. And since the lace is already finished at the bottom, I needed to already have the lining finished as well. So after it was finished, I then laid it onto the lace, putting the right side of the satin to the back side of the lace, and then just ran a basting stitch around all of the edges except for the edge that had already been hemmed. And when I laid the lining onto the lace, I made sure to place it so that the hem of the lining was just above the highest point on the scallops. Once they were all basted together, I then cut the pieces out of the lace, basically just cutting around the edges of the satin. The back skirt pieces still had darts at the waist, so I went ahead and sewed those. And then I set about removing all of the sequins along the side seams that were within the seam allowance. And the reason for that is because I am using French seams to sew this skirt. And that's because I wanted something that would just be a neater finish to the seams as opposed to using the sojo to finish them, which would leave a bunch of white thread on the inside, which granted no one would see, but I would know they were there, so I went ahead and opted for the French seams. Since I'm doing French seams though, those seams needed to lay really flat, which is why I removed all of those sequins, which there were a lot more than even is shown in the video. Once they were removed, I attached the back skirt pieces to the front pieces at the side seams, as I said, using a French seam. So a French seam is when you start by placing the pieces with the wrong sides together and sew a narrow seam about half to a little less than half of your seam allowance. So in my case, I sewed a 1/4 inch seam as I did this. And then you flip the pieces so that they are right sides together and sew that seam again, this time using the remainder of your seam allowance, in my case 3/8 of a seam allowance, to sew it again. And what that does is it encloses all of those raw edges onto the inside. And then after that, the last step for the skirt right now was to sew the facing on the vent at the bottom of the skirt. So basically these tabs here at the bottom are either to be sewn all along with the back seam to kind of create enough room for walking, or be turned back and hemmed to create kind of a vent, again, just for ease of walking. So I opted for the second option. I turned the top down at an angle and then folded it all over twice so that the raw edges were hidden and whip stitched it down. And then I removed the rest of the sequins that were in the seam allowance along that center back seam, because that's where the zipper is going to go. And I already learned the hard way once that if I don't remove those sequins, they will interfere with the zipper. Setting aside the skirt for a minute, I moved on to working on the bodice. Now, I chose this black satin for the bodice as well as for the lining. So I cut out 2 center front pieces, 4 side front pieces, 4 side back pieces, and 4 center back pieces, because this is going to have a center back zipper. Once all of the pieces were cut out, I set about with assembling, which starts by sewing the side pieces to their respective center pieces. So side front to center front, and side back to center back of both the lining and the outer fabric, which in this case is all the same. And after I sewed those seams, I did also stay stitch the necklines. And if that sounds like it was an afterthought, it's because it definitely was. So stay stitching is supposed to help along curved edges of necklines, usually is where I see it used the most, to keep them from stretching out. It's not something I tend to worry about, but I did decide that I should probably do it on this one because with that shape and that curve, it just seemed like it was more likely to stretch out than some of the other projects that I have done in the past. Then I attached the back bodice pieces to the front pieces at the shoulder seams for both the main and lining fabric. So I mentioned earlier that I thought the outer edges of the shoulder seams were too pointy. So to remedy that, after I had sewn both shoulder seams, I took one of the pieces and I took a circle pattern and kind of lined it up with that edge and sort of rounded it out to hopefully help it not look so sharp. Then I laid the 2 bodices right sides together and sewed around the neckline. I clipped the curves and then flipped it so that the wrong sides were together and pressed in place. I then went back and stay stitched the neckline, which basically means sewing that seam allowance down to the lining, which kind of helps everything lay neater around the neckline. And then I placed the pieces once again right sides together and sewed around the armhole opening, clipped the curves, and flipped everything right sides out. Now normally if I wasn't going to take the time to stay stitch the neckline, I would have done the armholes and the neckline all in one go and then clipped it and flipped it once. But for the purposes of stay stitching, it just made more sense to do it in 2 separate steps because it is way easier to sew the neckline for stay stitching if the armholes have not been sewn yet. Next, I am sewing the side seams, and because of how this is lined and everything, it's kind of cool because you're able to sew up the side seam of the lining and across the underarm seam and then like back down the side seam of the outer fabric all in one go. Now to attach the skirt, I started by taking the bodice and pulling apart the outer fabric from the lining piece so that I was only pinning the skirt to the bodice at the waist and not to the lining. I then sewed it in place, pulled the lining back down, and folded up the raw edge before whip stitching it to the skirt on the inside. And here is the only time I used the serger on this project, which was just to serge the raw edges of that center back opening only where the zipper was going to be. So down the bodice and partway down the skirt on both sides. I then attached the zipper using an invisible zipper foot, which if you don't have one and you've been trying to do invisible zippers, it is so much easier when you have the correct foot for this. After the zipper was attached, I closed the remainder of the skirt center back seam using a French seam. So the only thing that I really didn't end up liking about this dress is still just those shoulder seams. To me, they still look a little funny. And looking back at the book and the pictures of the dress that was shown in that, maybe I still made the straps too wide, but it would have been hard for me to make them any narrower without having to change the shape of my princess seam pattern, which I could have done, but I really just didn't feel like doing at the time. So other than that, I do think it looks really good, and I am very pleased that I was able to use the lace for the skirt because I really do think it looks better than it necessarily would have looked if I had only had enough to do the bodice. And on top of that, it's a strange thing to be so proud of, but I am very excited with how little serging I did on this dress. So typically when I finish seams on a dress, if it's going to be visible at all and not lined, I usually just use the serger, but like I said, it leaves kind of some ugly white thread on the insides on most things, which for an everyday dress isn't a big deal, but every once in a while it's kind of fun to go to the extra effort to do French seams or something like that to really make even the inside of the garment look nice. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.